The project was led by McGill University and included collaborators from the University of Saskatchewan and Dalhousie University. The severity of global climate change was reinforced in the recent IPCC report released on August the 9th. The report's alarming headline title is that climate change is widespread, rapid, and intensifying. The report states that unless there are immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to close to 1.5 degrees C or even 2 degrees C will be beyond reach. And the report also mentions that no region is spared. Of particular relevance to today's symposium are the following factoids. Climate change is intensifying the water cycle. This brings more intense rainfall and associated flooding, as well as more intense drought in many regions. Further warming will amplify frost thawing and the loss of seasonal snow cover. In Canada, agricultural emissions make up about 12% of total national GHG emissions if we include both on-farm and off-farm activities. Emissions have risen from about 65 million tons to 80 million tons of CO2 and CO2 equivalent over the past 25 years. Canada's agri-food sector is therefore challenged to reverse this trend and find ways to sequester more carbon in soils, as Canada is a signatory to the 2015 Paris Accord. As noted by the IPCC, a 1.5 degree pathway includes bold integrated policies that enable higher socio-technical transition speeds, larger deployment scales, and the phase out of existing systems that lock in CO2 emissions for decades. This requires deep decarbonization pathways and a net zero carbon energy economy system. Not only is technological innovation required, but also more profound behavioral, economic, and policy transformation. More effort is required in carbon trading and carbon pricing. It is for this reason that our agricultural greenhouse gases project incorporated a strong socio-economic component in addition to our technological research. And so today you will be hearing about some of these findings from both components on the technology and the socio-economic aspects. Given the relatively short duration of today's program and mindful of the different time zones, we are only able to present a fraction of the research findings based on work conducted by some of the graduate students and researchers. While we are reporting on work conducted primarily in Eastern Canada, we believe that some of the methodology and findings are pertinent to other regions of the world. We therefore hope that you will find the talks beneficial in your own program of work. The full program of the symposium can be found on the McGill Faculty of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences main website, and I hope you obtained a copy at the time of registration. Before I introduce our speakers, I wish to thank the sponsors of this symposium, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, the Canadian Water Resources Association, the International Commission on Irrigation and Drainage, and in this context, I'm pleased to acknowledge the presence of the president of ICID, Dr. Ragab, who has joined us from the United Kingdom. And I also acknowledge the Global Research Alliance, sponsorship of the Global Research Alliance, and Fulbright Canada. To start off the program, I would now like to invite the President and CEO of Fulbright Canada, Dr. Michael Hawes, to say a few words of welcome. Dr. Hawes works tirelessly to promote Canada-US scholarly relations and is a strong advocate of US-Canada academic collaboration in the area of environment and climate change. Dr. Hawes, please, sir.
Well, thank you for inviting me to speak to the group, Chandra. I'm speaking to you this morning from Ottawa, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin peoples. I am, as Chandra said, the CEO of the Foundation for Educational Exchange, which is the organization which runs Fulbright here in Canada. I'm a political science professor by trade. My home institution is Queen's. I'm always, especially when I'm speaking to scientists, when I admit to being a political science professor, I always say the first step is admitting it. So I come with my own baggage and my own background. I have spent my career mostly at Queen's, but I've also taught at Berkeley, the University of Southern California, the University of Tokyo, Kokusa Daigaku in Japan, and ITAM in Mexico. My role now, though, is to advance public policy, science, scholarship, and research, and do what we can to support the good work that you all do. Fulbright Canada, you probably all know of Fulbright. There is a slight misnomer that we are exclusively a US government program. And while we are funded in part by the United States government, Fulbright is a public sector, private sector partnership supported by both governments, by other universities, by foundations, and by private sector partners. We are a field open program, which is to say we're interested in all varieties of scholarship and research, but we're particularly interested in contemporary public policy challenges like climate change and the science that goes behind those public policy challenges. We are, again, particularly interested in climate, in security issues, in public health, and a number of other things. We also, like so many of you and your institutions, are committed to diversity, inclusion, and equity in all of the programs that we operate. And we are especially committed in this country to helping advance issues and opportunities for Indigenous persons in this country. We are, as I said, a partnership-based organization, and I'm pleased to say that McGill is one of our core partners and has been since the inception of the program. We work very closely with the principal, the provost, colleagues like Chandra and others across the institution. We give scholarships and we create visiting research chairs, but we also support events, research activities, and in particular, the movement and collaboration of researchers, whether they're undergraduate students, graduate students, or colleagues. In addition to Fulbright, we also run a big undergraduate program called the Killam Fellowships Program. And in partnership with MyTax, we run a STEM program every year. This year, we brought 70 American graduate students to Canada across the country to work on issues like climate change. Today, though, my short message to you is very simple. We'd like to work in support of what you're doing, to work with Chandra and others in this group to take the next step and keep the collaboration alive, the research going, the important work that you're doing in place. So Chandra and I have been working on the possibility of a more permanent arrangement, partnership, which would support the work in the Great Lakes region and beyond of science and research in the area of climate. That would mean support for graduate students. It would mean support for scholars through our chairs program. And I think it would encourage and support additional collaborative research. Let me just end by saying I'm excited about this partnership with my friend and colleague at McGill, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak to you this morning. And finally, I do want to congratulate you all for doing work that is so timely and so important. I'm always encouraged not to take any political views, but I don't think this is a political view. Climate change indeed may be the most pressing issue of our time. So, Dr. Madramutu, thank you for inviting me here. Colleagues, thank you for the work you do.
Thank you very much, Michael, and always a pleasure to work with you, and also to have the support of Fulbright behind such an important topic that not just crosses our two borders, but is also of international significance and importance, especially given the COP conference coming up in Glasgow. So thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now a very significant honor to invite Professor Ratan Lal, a distinguished professor of soil science and director of the Carbon Management and Sequestration Center at the Ohio State University, to give the keynote address. Professor Lal is the world's preeminent soils expert who has devoted his entire career to the improvement of soil health, sustainable agriculture, soil conservation, and soil productivity through better carbon management practices. Professor Lal is a highly decorated researcher, accomplished scholar with numerous awards, including the Nobel Prize as a co-author of the IPCC report with Senator Al Gore, Vice President Al Gore, most recently as the recipient of the World Food Prize. Professor Lal, it's certainly a very distinguished honor for us to have you grace our symposium, and the floor is now yours, sir. Please, and we'll share the slides so that you can proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you see the screen, please?
Yes.
Thank you. To begin with, I want to thank Dr. Chandra Madramutu and also Dr. Michael Hayes for inviting me. I very much appreciate this opportunity. I also like the statement that Dr. Haas made, that climate change is not a political issue. Indeed, it's a planetary and humanity issue because it's affecting the future of the planet and the humanity as a whole. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about soil and agriculture as a source and sink of greenhouse gases. So to begin with, I'm going to talk a few definitions. Greenhouse gases are symmetric polar molecules. For example, CO and NO, HOH, are C and 4H, but all of them are symmetric molecules. And as the long wave radiation hits them as emitted from the earth, they vibrate, create momentum, and therefore retain energy back into the atmosphere, which is the cause of the greenhouse effect, which is a good thing. But when the greenhouse effect is accelerated by human activity, then it becomes a global warming. And the global warming, the tipping point is when the warming is more than 0.1 degrees centigrade per decade. At present, the rate of warming is almost 0.2 degrees centigrade per decade. I also want to give the definition of agriculture, which most of you know what it is, but from my point of view, agriculture is the science and art of managing soil and other soil-less media for growing crops and raising livestock by harnessing solar energy, and that's the key process of photosynthesis for mitigating the climate change as well, and the efficient use of water and plant nutrients. So the last part, harnessing solar energy through efficient use of water and plant nutrients, is critical. I must say a few words about soil-less cropping system as well. The shrinking arable land, warming climate, increasing water scarcity, and growing urban and total population makes it necessary for soil scientists and agriculturists to look beyond the traditional agriculture, which is soil-based operation, to highly efficient greenhouse and vertical farms involving aquaculture, aquaponics, hydroponics, aeroponics, aerofarm, and other soilless solution. And I think this is a kind of deviation from the norm, but it's very, very important, especially in water scarce countries, and especially minimize the social problem. And Dr. Chandra Madramoto mentioned the human dimension part of this particular workshop. So land grab is a human issue that we need to address. I also want to define soil. Soil is a living entity. A healthy soil contains about 5 metric tons of living biomass per hectare. A healthy soil is also the largest storehouse of terrestrial biodiversity, almost 25% of it. And without healthy soil, the biotic activity and the species diversity, soil is not a soil. Essentially, all life depends on the soil. There can be no life without soil, and no soil without life. They have evolved together. So said Charles Kellogg of USDA last century. I would like to add to that something from my side, that rhizosphere, the soil root interface at a nanoscale, is the only site known in the universe where, because of the divine power in soil, if I may use the word divine, it had the capacity to transform death into life. That's the only place. That is why the soil is living. That's why soil as a living entity must have rights to be protected, restored, and managed judiciously for ecosystem services such as food and climate security, which is the focus of discussion today. Agricultural expansion happened dramatically since the beginning of the Christian era. Population was only about 200 million at that time. The population right now is 7.8 billion. Cropland area increased from about 130 million hectare to 1.5 billion hectare. Pasture land from 100 million hectare to 3.5 billion hectare. Irrigated land area almost 350 million hectare. This transformation of the terrestrial biosphere from natural to managed ecosystem has drastically disturbed the carbon cycle and therefore the global warming. Normally we talk about global warming caused by fossil fuel. I would like to state that greenhouse gas emission from human activity began 10,000 years ago with the onset of settled agriculture. Therefore, the so-called Anthropocene got accelerated with the Industrial Revolution. It began with the beginning of agriculture. There's a big difference between the two. And realization of this difference will give us the solution to this humongous problem. What do you do with agriculture? What do you do with land? When the forest is converted to agricultural land, in 8000 BC, when agriculture began, we had 6.5 billion hectare, now less than 4 billion hectare. The carbon contained in the biomass due to conversion is emitted into the atmosphere, along with nitrogen and other gases as well. So anthropogenic emissions since the beginning of agriculture, prehistoric, estimate 320 gigaton from the beginning of agriculture to 1750. From 1750 to 2019, another 255 gigaton. The later 255 is more authentic than 320. Fossil fuel emission from 1750 to 2019, 445. Therefore, land use conversion thus far has 575 gigaton compared with fossil fuel emission to date, about 450 gigaton. There again, the land use share, 65% total if you combine 700 gigaton since the Industrial Revolution, 65% from fossil fuel and 35% from land use conversion. And this has increased the global temperature already to 1.2 degrees centigrade, 1.2. And although the question is that it cannot be changed to less than 2 degrees centigrade mitigation, I think if we adopt non-carbon fuel sources now, let's say from 2030, and reconvert the land use in such a way that most of the carbon lost from the terrestrial biosphere, 575 gigaton, even if half of it can be put back, the future of climate change is still in our hand. And I want to emphasize that. Only if we find non-carbon fuel sources and recarbonize the biosphere, which has many reasons. We also have conversion of land used to agriculture, degraded lands. Almost 1/3 of the ice-free land is degraded by erosion, both water and wind, salinity, and sediment transport. Sediment transport specifically, carbon is a very selective process. The carbon contained in the surface layer, which is preferentially removed by erosion because it's light friction, is tremendous loss of carbon from eroded sediment. The question is, when the sediments go into the ocean and deposited and buried there, are they sink for carbon? Maybe they are when they get there. But never forget that before they get to the ocean or to the burial space, being moved over the landscape and being disturbed because of the impact of the raindrop moving water and wind and carbon released, is transformed into greenhouse gases, CO2, CH4, and N2O, even in depressional sites. So the overall process of soil erosion is a source of greenhouse gases. Soil degradation also disturbs the biogeochemical cycle. The coupled cycling of water with carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur is the source of essential ecosystem services, including carbon sequestration. Soil degradation and anthropogenic activity has decoupled these cycles. And therefore, decoupling of the carbon cycle has created the problems of disturbance of the atmospheric chemistry, and therefore the accelerated global warming. In addition, of course, other ecosystem services are also hindered. That brings me to the question of what is regenerative agriculture. To mitigate the climate change, making agriculture a solution. I know agriculture is blamed for all the evils of environment. It is a previous justified complaint, but if we all insist on eating food, I for one definitely want to, we have a responsibility to improve agriculture, to make it a solution to climate change. So what is regenerative agriculture? It's inspired by eco-innovation. It's powered by non-carbon energy. It's driven by a circular economy and green infrastructure. And it's supported by the recarbonization of the terrestrial biosphere as the bedrock of sustainable development. Remember that 575 gigaton of carbon that came from land use conversion since 8000 BC. We should have a strategy to put it back. 5 billion hectares of land and agriculture, we don't need it. Perhaps 1 billion hectares by the end of 2050, another billion hectares by the end of 2100 should go back to nature and recarbonize the terrestrial biosphere. Soil carbon sequestration is an important part. When you convert from forest to agricultural land within about 50 years in temperate climate, such as where we are talking about Canada, northern part of the US, temperate region, 50% of the soil carbon stock is lost in about 50 years. This 50% loss may happen in tropical climate, perhaps in 10 years or less. If the erosion is continuing, the carbon loss will continue. If the erosion is controlled, there might be carbon stabilized. And at some point in time, if we adopt better agricultural practices, regenerative, for example, in about 20 to 25, 30 years, it may reach another equilibrium level. At that point, you adopt another better practice. Perhaps you can reach another equilibrium in another 25 years. Remember, I'm talking about generation, 25 years, not overnight. And in about 50 years, it's possible to reach the original level of the carbon where it was whenever they converted the land. It's possible to get to that level. Even if we can get to about 66% of what we had lost, which we call the carbon sink capacity, we are still in a good shape. Many times people say, can you go beyond what the original level are? In some cases, yes, but in most cases, not. cases where there were limitation under natural condition, yes, you can. And we can define many things such as carbon sink capacity, such as mean residence time, which is pool over flex. And then the question is, how can you do this? There's no one practice. We got conservation agriculture, regenerative agriculture, integrated nutrient, pest management, biochar, agroforestry, afforestation, pasture management, certainly water harvesting, farming system improvement. But each of these practices have their own carbon footprint and water footprint. Therefore, finding practices which is a lesser carbon footprint is really a very important option. Many times people talk about which practice. Only that practice that creates a positive carbon budget, not a negative carbon budget. And positive means the gain of carbon into the system are less than the losses by erosion, leaching, decomposition. Unfortunately, in developing countries and elsewhere with resource poor farmer, we do not have a positive carbon budget. We mostly have a system of negative carbon budget, losing carbon all the time along with creating greenhouse gases. The rate of carbon sequestration, if we adopt better agricultural practices, is more in cooler, moist, temperate climate than in warmer, hot, arid, and semi-arid region. The maximum rate could be perhaps wetland restoration, 1.5 metric ton per hectare per year, afforestation, probably 1 ton, no-till farming, probably about 0.5 ton, rangeland, because in arid and semi-arid region, probably 100 to 200 kilogram per hectare. The total technical potential of soils of the world, all soils of the world, cropland, forest land, grazing land, degraded land, urban land, all other ecosystem, is about 2.5 gigaton of carbon per year. Many times people ask a question, can you mitigate climate change completely with this? Absolutely not. The fossil fuel emission in 2020 was more than 10 gigaton of carbon. So 2.5 is about 25%. But between 2020 and 2100, soils have maximum potential of about 180 gigaton of carbon sink capacity. Vegetation have another 155. Together about 330 gigaton, which is equivalent to 160 parts per million of drawdown of CO2. Therefore, if we find no carbon fuel sources soon, like 2030, and we recarbonize the biosphere, it is still possible to keep global warming to less than 2 degrees centigrade. It can be done, it should be done. And farming carbon, rewarding farmer for doing good thing so that they can create another income stream through policy intervention is one of the important options. How much should farmer be paid? Undervaluing this very precious resource and saying we'll pay you $5 per acre, $5 per ton of CO2, or even $10, undervaluing this very precious resource will lead to tragedy of the commons. The real price is something like 25 euro per credit, which is 1 ton of CO2, or $30 to $35. If farmers sequester 0.5 ton per hectare, they deserve $65 per hectare. If they sequester 1/3 of a ton, about $43 per hectare. That's the societal real price. I want to briefly mention about the UN Food Systems Summit, the transformation of this food system. It is generally believed that current food systems have failed. They have failed to end hunger and malnutrition. 820 million people hungry, more than 2 billion malnourished, more than 3 billion cannot afford healthy, safe, nutritious diet, therefore need to change. They haven't provided adequate nutritious diet, and they have degraded soil and aggravated global warming, dwindled biodiversity, and denuded landscape. Therefore, agriculture and food system need immediate action transfer. 30% of all greenhouse gases come from food system, not agriculture system, food system. And therefore, it's a time to change to a sustainable food system. A sustainable food system is the one that delivers food security and nutrition for all in such a way that the economic, social, environmental basis to generate food security and nutrition for future generation are not compromised. It meets the need of the present, but the futures are not compromised. So the transformation, the concept of sustainable food system implies an option of change from less to relatively more sustainable option, especially the number 13. Number 2 is end hunger. Number 13 is climate action. And number 15 is for the land neutrality, land degradation neutrality. So therefore, in this context, the UN Food System Summit transformation means identification and implementation of policies, innovation, institution to alleviate adverse effect of agriculture on the environment, such as climate change and other issues. Therefore, the circular bioeconomy is definitely one of the options. We are talking about nature positive production system to mitigate climate change. Remember 575 gigaton that we have stolen, created a debt of carbon from the terrestrial biosphere, put it back. Reduce emission, increase carbon capture, regenerate and protect critical ecosystem, reduce food waste and energy use, and without undermining health and nutrition. The world soil, unfortunately, I read this morning, the statement by Secretary General, it does not appear in it. It did not appear in any of the 17 sustainable development goals. Millennium development goals were not met, sustainable development goal was not met. If we do not think of sustainable soil management, unfortunately, the UN Food System Summit slogan is also empty. Carbon pie, my last slide. How much carbon can we emit? We have about 410 parts per million now. Doubling the CO2 from the industrial time, which was 280, now 560. 560 minus 410, 400, multiply about 2 gigaton per 1 ppm. That's about 320 gigaton we have at the most humanity can emit before goes beyond tipping point. The question is this 320 gigaton of carbon pie that remains, how do we divide amongst humanity equally, ethically, morally, socially, economically, justifiably? That point was not discussed by the UN Food System Summit. I think it cannot be ignored. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Lal, for such an illuminating presentation. This has been a tremendous boost to the conference, the symposium. The points that you have raised have been really very spectacular in terms of us awakening and arising to some of the realities. You touched on many things from the science going right through to carbon pricing and put in figures in terms of 43 to 65 tons per hectare as a societal cost for carbon, and the fact that we pay far more for nickel, for example, and the whole concept of regenerative agriculture, a sustainable food system, the fact that soil is not in the SDGs and it has not even been brought to bear in the Food Systems Summit. I think these are some very striking points that you have raised, very poignant points for us to bear in mind as we go forward. So thank you very, very much, Professor Lal, for this illuminating presentation, as usual. I'm going to ask the audience to please hold the questions and the discussion for the end of the next talk, and then we will open it up to questions and comments from the floor to both Professor Lal and to our next speaker. So please put any questions that you might have into the chat, and later on when we come to the Q&A period, you may also raise your hand using the reactions button. So Thank you very, very much. I'm now going to invite our next speaker to give the feature presentation, Dr. Tim Searchinger. Dr. Searchinger is the director of the Food Program and a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute in Washington, D.C., and is also a faculty member at Princeton University. He is the author of the landmark World Resource Institute report, Creating a Sustainable Food Future, in which he discusses, among other topics, the reduction of greenhouse gases, increasing sequestered carbon to feed nearly 10 billion people by the year 2050. So, Dr. Searchinger, please proceed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me make sure that you can see my screen. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay, well, thanks so much. So there are a couple of reports that the World Resources Institute we put out that you can get the basic messages from my slide in greater detail, Creating a Sustainable Food Future, and a report we did on how to make Danish agriculture carbon neutral that may have even more implications for an advanced agricultural economy such as Canada's. We start with the fact that agriculture occupies half of the world's vegetated land. And if you exclude the really colder vegetated lands, it's even a much larger percentage. And that occupation is responsible for something like 30% of the carbon that people have added to the atmosphere. It's also responsible for about a quarter of the world's annual greenhouse gas emissions. About 10% are from the continued clearing of land and peatland degradation, and 15% are from the production process. And the production process, above all, involves microorganisms interacting with carbon in wet environments. And that includes, of course, cow belching, ruminant enteric methane, rice methane, nitrous oxide, and manure from all kinds of nitrogen use and manure management. And land use change, of course, is ongoing at a very high rate. We're clearing on the order of 5 to 10 million hectares of land per year, putting carbon into the atmosphere. Here's the Amazon, which is being converted, where the most direct use of it is typically beef. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed my slides. These were the other slides. I got them a little mixed up. This is nitrogen use. And then on-farm energy, of course, people focus on as well. But when you look at these together, one of the things that surprises some people is that the energy use in agriculture is a relatively small part of the emissions. Of the production process, it's only around a fifth, and about half of the emissions are essentially from ruminant animals, cows, sheep, and goats. And that's enteric fermentation, waste on pasture, a certain amount of the feed production through soil fertilization and manure management. So that's something to keep, I'm going to keep coming back to, which is greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture are heavily about ruminants, half of the production emissions, and probably something in the order of 70–75% of the land use. Now, it's also important that we keep food prices low. We still have a tremendous number of hungry people in the world, and the worst statistic I think of all is that a third of the children in the developing world are stunted. The biggest area of hunger deprivation is Africa, but also South Asia. And one of the things we need to do is keep food prices low. And I like to show this slide because people neglect this, but the steady decline of food prices is one reason why, as the population increased dramatically in this period from starts around 1950, the actual percentage of people hungry in the world declined. And when we had large increases in food prices around 2008 and again in 2011, you had large increases in hunger. So our challenge is that we need to produce a lot more food. The population is going to go from what is now about 6.8 billion people to almost 10 billion people by 2050. And there's not much really we can do about that. There are high fertility rates still in Africa, but a lot of that is just due to the aging population that already exists. And then as incomes increase, people demand more food, which is a good thing. So there's a general agreement that we need from 2010 to 2050 more than 50% more food production. And that includes a 70% growth in milk and meat. And milk and meat, of course, take a lot more resources, and that's an added challenge. Now, to meet that, we're going to have the pathway is likely to actually have an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. Virtually, I neglected to mention that virtually all strategies for solving climate change assume that we have essentially no net deforestation between now and 2050. Dr. Lal talked about restoring land, but we need 50% more food. We're on a path to demand 50% more food and 70% more milk and meat. And that is a path toward increasing land use. Now, even if we have yields kind of grow at their more or less historic rate, our greenhouse gas emissions, we estimate, will go from 12 billion tons to 15 billion tons. And these are the emissions without mitigation in the energy sector. But we need agriculture to stabilize the climate to go to about 4 billion tons. At 15 billion tons, when we wrote the report, that was viewed as 70% of the allowable emissions from all human sources. That actually would be probably today viewed as all of the allowable emissions. So agriculture alone, 2 or 3% of the global economy would itself produce all the greenhouse gas emissions allowable from all human sources. So the bottom line is agriculture needs to produce more than 50% more food while cutting greenhouse gas emissions by 2/3. Now, how do we do that? We have hundreds of pages going through the various strategies for doing it, but they can be summarized in the following 4 concepts. Produce, protect, reduce, and restore. Produce more food on the same land. Use that to protect forests and other natural habitats. Reduce our demand for land every way we can, through dietary change, food loss and waste, avoiding biofuels, and restore habitat to the extent that we can. So I'm going to go through those in a little bit more detail. First, why produce? So the slides I showed you before were actually a little bit misleading in a way. So here are greenhouse gas emissions today and the ongoing emissions from land use change. Now, if we try to produce all the food we're likely to need in 2050 with today's farms, today's technology, the greenhouse gas emissions are not 15 billion tons, but more like 38 billion tons. Now, a lot of that would be from land use change. We would have to clear about an additional 3 billion hectares of land, which would basically mean we wouldn't really have forests left in the temperate or tropical zones. So we build into our projection, which was the 15 billion tons, ongoing yield growth at historical rates. But that's not easy. In the yield growth from 1960 to today resulted from doubling irrigation, from bringing synthetic fertilizer to most of the world, to introducing scientifically bred seeds to almost all the world. And those technologies aren't available to us anymore. And even with those, we had massive land use change. So we basically have to do even better to produce more food on the same land. Well, there are lots of things we talk about in the report, but one of the things to emphasize is 2/3 of the world's land is grazing land. And one of the really critical things we need to do is to produce more output from grazing land per hectare. So there's in Latin America, there are vast areas of badly managed grazing land. There are known ways to improve that through rotating cows, fertilizing, or using legumes on grasslands, a whole range of supplemental feeding techniques of dry seasons. And you can easily triple the output of most of the wetter grazing land in Latin America. It's an institutional but not a technical challenge. Now, one of the good things about improving ruminant output is that as you increase the output per cow, not only do you use less land, but you have much fewer greenhouse gas emissions. So here on the y-axis here, you have the greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of milk. And on the x-axis, you have the kilograms of milk per cow. And as you make improvements from kind of really badly fed cattle to better fed cattle, you get rapid, large reductions. And this is just the production emissions, not even the land use. And globally, and even though I'm showing this for milk, there's a similar graph I could show for beef. And globally, there is a huge difference in the greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of protein from beef. So in Africa, you're talking numbers that are, 30 to more than 100 times the greenhouse gas emissions. In Europe, even double those of India and Latin America. So one of the things we need to do is to essentially, of the cattle that we're producing, we need to produce them more efficiently. Now, some of that can be with new technologies or new approaches. This is an intensive silvopastoral system in Colombia. It's a wonderful system that has high yielding grasses, a protein fixing shrub layer, a layer of trees to help keep moisture in, and you can get 5 to even 10 times the production, plus some carbon, plus some improved biodiversity. But this is literally only on less than 100,000 hectares of land, probably more like 50,000 in Colombia. And Colombia itself has at least 20 million hectares of grazing land. So we know how to do this. It's a dramatically different system, but making that happen is a huge challenge. There are also opportunities in developed countries. So this is something they're trying in Denmark, which is that instead of feeding dairy cows silage maize, you can instead grow a high protein grass. You press out the grass, and about 20% of it turns into a high protein feed, the equivalent of soybeans. The remainder replaces silage maize. And if you have higher yields from the grasses, you can save land, reduce nitrous oxide, reduce soil erosion, even build some soil carbon. And so it's a wonderful opportunity, and it's an example of the innovations that we need. Here's an example, another of an innovation, and a key theme is the need for innovations. Given the scope of the challenge that I've described, we aren't going to do it without dramatic innovative methods. And so here's an example of an Asian tree that has been little used for agriculture. It produces a oil seed that's similar in quality to soybeans, has the potential perhaps to increase the yield dramatically relative to soybeans. It's now being tried out in South Florida. This is an example, it's a nitrogen fixing tree. It will also gain some carbon. This is an example of the type of thing we should be testing. But we also need, another innovation are things that can combine reducing production emissions and increasing output per hectare. So I'm fond of something called biological nitrification inhibition. So nitrous oxide comes after nitrogen in soil is turned from ammonium into nitrate and then breaks down and forms nitrous oxide. It turns out that plants, a number of plants in the tropics naturally exude a chemical that inhibits the transformation of ammonium into nitrate, resulting in very little nitrous oxide. And it was discovered with this grass, Brachiaria humidicola, in Latin America. Well, that has now been successfully bred into wheat with a recent paper in PNAS. But it's not only an opportunity to reduce nitrous oxide emissions, but there's a long history that suggests that if we combine ammonium and nitrate in soils instead of what are now almost only nitrate conditions after a few days, you can actually get yield gains. And in fact, they're seeing yield gains. So these are another example of the importance of innovation. Okay, protect. Producing more food in the same land isn't enough. And the reason is that even though you can help reduce the total amount of agricultural land, you can switch where agriculture is produced and get more clearing in the tropics. So this is an example of how soybean yields and maize yields have grown in Brazil. And even as those yields have grown, the actual area used for them has also expanded. Why? Because basically producing soybeans and maize became more globally competitive in Brazil, and it could supply more of that. And while that allows land to be reforested elsewhere in China, Europe, for example, it's not a fair deal because we're losing more carbon and more biodiversity by clearing more land. And so yield gains alone won't save land. And what you see, little understood, is that a lot of deforestation is actually due to shifting of agricultural land. And I'm not talking about traditional Sweden agriculture, but just the fact that agriculture moves. So agriculture is moving from an area from China and Europe to Latin America as they rely on beef and soybean imports. But even in Latin America, you get reforestation here in these blue areas and deforestation in the tropics. And to stop that, we need to have real governance that prevents that type of conversion. We also need to stop building roads into tropical forests. Once you build roads, you're almost certainly going to clear more land. So we need a whole set of linked programs that increase output per hectare, but link that explicitly to protection of forests and other natural habitats. Now, we also need to reduce our demand for land. And one of those things, above all, is beef. So the emissions from beef and the land use requirements from beef are off the charts compared to any other food product. So here in this chart, you show the reduction emissions in the orange bar. And these are what we could think of as the carbon opportunity cost, the amount of carbon we lose from land to produce beef. And you see it's off the charts. Basically, beef is on the order of 5 times the emissions of land use of dairy, 8 to 9 times that of pork, chicken, eggs, and of course, a lot more even than plant-based foods like pulses. In the US diet, the red here is beef. So here you have the total calorie consumption. Beef is 3% of the consumption of calories, but it is about almost half the land use and almost half of the greenhouse gas emissions. So above all, we need to reduce our consumption of beef. Now in the US and I suspect Canada, I don't really know, I haven't looked it up. In Europe, we're actually consuming about 1/3 less beef per person than we did in 1970, mainly shifting to chicken. So it's a doable task. And let me so in our scenarios, it is necessary for people in countries that consume large quantities of ruminant meat to reduce that. And let me just show you this chart again. It's a complicated chart, but it's very meaningful. On the x-axis is the number of people in each country or region likely to exist in 2050. And on the y-axis is the consumption of ruminant meat, basically beef. And what you see is that we have the number of people in the world, and the red bar is consumption today. The yellow bar includes our projected consumption in 2050 based on FAO estimates. And what you see is only about 20% of the world consumes large quantities of beef. And most of the world consumes extremely little. And even in 2050, we'll eat much less, or we won't eat that much. And what we basically need to do is we need to have people in these 20% of the countries reducing their beef consumption by about 50%. And the US, that means a hamburger and a half per week instead of 3. Again, innovation can play an important role. Here's an example of the Impossible Burger. It really does taste to me exactly like hamburger. Hopefully the price of that in the next few years will come down to match that of beef. And once that happens, we need to promote that everywhere in the world. And reduce also means, of course, doing things to reduce production emissions. Here's an example of a feed additive, 3-NOP, that looks like it can reduce enteric methane. Algae also can reduce enteric methane. These need to be quickly developed within a few years with dramatically more effort to the point where they can be broadly used. Okay, restore. So right now, there is a tendency to overestimate the potential to restore land. So you see these large claims of huge environmental benefits from reforesting land. And that is true. We could reforest a lot of land, but right now we're using that land to produce food. And even with large yield gains, unless we do all this producing more food in the same land, unless we reduce our demand for land intensive foods, we're actually going to clear more land. So in reality, large scale restoration depends on produce, protect, and reduce. However, there are areas we can start restoring right now. And the best example are peatlands. So here's an example of a peatland, which are highly carbon-rich soils in Indonesia. Peatlands there have been extensively drained and turned into acacia plantations and palm oil plantations. They're drained peatlands everywhere in the world. And 0.5% of global agricultural land is drained peatlands. And when you drain them, that lets the soils break down and emit vast quantities of carbon. And 2% of all the global emissions in the world, not just agricultural emissions, but global emissions of all sources, come from the 0.5% of global land that is drained peatlands. So the highest priority, when we talk about soil carbon, the highest priority is to re-wet these drained peatlands. And similarly, there are other places, this is the Atlantic coastal rainforest, where you have a grazing land that's not very efficient and where there's no real likelihood of making it more efficient because it's so sloped, and we should be restoring those areas. So the last thing I'm going to leave you with is the importance of properly valuing land from a carbon perspective, because we can make terrible mistakes if we don't do that. Land is a fixed resource. We can't make more land. And not only that, the potential productivity on that land is controlled ultimately by light and rainfall. And this is a map of the global primary productivity, net primary productivity, basically plant growth of native vegetation. And you see there's only so much of it. And we need to use that potential well. So there are strategies that are counterproductive. So for example, this is a claim that some people have, that we can have so-called carbon neutral beef by taking cropland out of production, turning it into grazing land, sequestering carbon on that land, and then that would offset the emissions from the methane of the cattle on that land. Well, why isn't that a good idea? The problem is that when you lose land for grazing and to produce beef, you're going to produce at maximum 1/10 of the amount of food as if you use that same land for cropland, even if you feed that to other livestock. So while improved grazing is a critical solution on existing grazing land, turning cropland into grazing land is not a solution. And basically this type of calculation just assumes that that land is free from a greenhouse gas perspective, when in fact, each hectare of land has to be preciously used. In the soil carbon area, I'm more skeptical, and I'm with those kind of scientists who are a little more skeptical than Dr. Lal of the potential to sequester carbon on working agricultural lands. But most of the soil carbon agenda is again about avoiding conversion of forests or restoring forests or restoring wetlands. So this was a paper that had a large number for the potential for global soil carbon protection, but the vast majority of that was avoiding the conversion of more forests or wetlands or restoring forests or wetlands. And all of that depends on our ability to shrink the amount of agricultural land we need, which means it depends on produce and reduce. It's not about agricultural practices on working lands, it's about saving land. And lastly, we need to avoid the terrible mistake of going down the bioenergy route. So bioenergy is simply one way of converting the energy in the sun into usable energy. And it's staggeringly inefficient. So sugarcane ethanol, which uses some of the best, most productive land in the world, converts 0.2% of the energy in the sun into usable energy. And even energy crop-based ethanol, the production at the most optimistic site in the entire United States would convert 0.35%.
And look,
if you use solar cells today, you're going to get 20%. And of course, you don't need to put solar cells on the world's most productive land. So on 75% of the world's land, you can get at least 100 times more usable energy using a solar technique than using bioenergy. And on about a quarter of the world's land is more like 5,000 times because it's dry. So people are calling for an amount of biomass that's about 230 exajoules, which would basically provide about 20% of the energy supply in 2050. How much of the world's biomass would that supply? How much of the world's harvested plant material would that require? The answer is all of it. All of our harvested crops, crop residues, wood, grass eaten by livestock, have a maximum energy potential around 230 exajoules. And the last thing I'll say is that to produce and protect, therefore, we need to go beyond simply deforestation-free commodities. It's important that commodities not come from recently deforested land, but that's not enough. We also have to produce more food on the same land. So the companies that are pledging to avoid deforestation, that's an important step forward, but they also have to be working with their suppliers to make sure that we're producing more food on the same land so that land isn't expanding somewhere, even if they're not the ones purchasing it. So I'll leave it with that. That's basically the principles: produce, protect, reduce, and restore. We need to innovate in the course of doing that, and we need to value land properly. And I'll stop it there.
Thank you very much, Tim. Again, another very illuminating presentation coming from some different viewpoints and with solid analysis that you and your colleagues have done at the WRI. Ladies and gentlemen, we have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. And so if anyone has a question, please raise it in the chat box for our 2 speakers, Professor Ratan-Lal and Dr. Searchinger. Please put it in the chat or raise your hand, please. I can't see everyone across the screen, so please use the reactions button.
Chandra, may I make a comment?
Yes, please, Suren, go ahead.
First of all, I want to thank Tim for a very good presentation. I had heard that his viewpoints are very different than mine, and he said that some. I'm impressed how similar his viewpoints are to mine. Protect, restore, and reduce and produce. I couldn't agree more with that philosophy. It's an excellent idea. I think if there is any difference, he looks at a thing from a pessimistic point of view. And I'm a born optimist, Tim. That's the difference. We have the same thinking, same philosophy. I think we can solve the problem through agriculture. You looking at agriculture from a very negative perspective. I'm looking at agriculture from a very positive perspective. But our concept, basic ideas, everything, I do not see any difference in that.
Well, I don't actually think I look at agriculture from a negative perspective in the following sense. So, for example, I don't think that the agricultural system has been a failure per se, in that it's caused massive environmental challenges, but it's fed 7 billion, almost 8 billion people. And the challenge is that feeding ourselves is just a staggering challenge, just like providing energy to this many people. And so the challenge we have is we have to do that even more without clearing any more land and while reducing these production emissions. Yeah. So in our report, we also think that there are solutions. And we agree. And I have this strategy for carbon neutral, even Denmark, with an advanced agricultural economy. And I think there are lots of promising innovations. There are lots of things we know how to do. Frankly, the world would hardly come to an end if the 20% of the world that eats massive quantities of beef reduced its beef by 50%. So we do have questionable solutions, but it is important that people understand the scope of the challenge, because if they don't understand the scope of the challenge, the solutions will not be addressed at the at the level required. That's all I would say. So I'm kind of optimistic too, maybe irrationally optimistic, but I do want people to understand the scope.
Thank you very much, Tim and Professor Lal for that. And Professor Lal, there's a question in the chat for you. And this is from someone who would like to know about the role of soil science today, what we need to focus on, or do we know enough about the science and we now need to focus on the social and policy sides? Please, sir.
Oh, thank you so much. I would say that we know enough about soil science that we must translate that science into action. We cannot be waiting for perfection. That's one thing I would like to point out again. Many times I hear we do not know how to evaluate soil health. We do not know how to evaluate soil carbon. I'm sorry, I teach soil science, so I will have to disagree with those concepts. But we definitely need to know more. There's no question about that. We definitely need to improve our monitoring techniques so they are very cost effective. This morning I saw a handheld device that can monitor carbon stock at a very cost without bringing sample. So we need to focus additional how to even look for producing more from less. I believe truly 5 billion hectares of land is too much. If we manage that land properly, I think at least 1 billion hectares should go back to nature. It's for our own good, and we can. Our yield gap in Africa and Asia, South Asia, especially sub-Saharan, is so much that doubling and tripling is possible. I've worked in both countries. I know it can be done. I do want to indicate that when we say we need to produce 50 to 70% more, I'm not sure if that figure is correct. We waste 50% for heaven's sake. If we, out of 3 billion tons of grains, we produce 1 billion tons reach no stomach. To produce more, waste, well, more, forget it, stop. So we must use what we have better, properly. We must take personal responsibility of not taking food and natural resources for granted. That I think the question of what is our priority? Priority is creating awareness about the value of soil and natural resources. I'm disappointed with Secretary General's report. I want to say it very loudly. I think it was written long before the discussion started. I have seen the previous version. I think this is a lack of awareness. And that is a priority soil scientists have to give. If we do not talk to policymakers, if we do not want to talk to agriculture minister and environmental minister and secretary general, we are loser. That's where the priority is.
Thank you very much, Professor Lal. Tim, the last question is for you. And this is from someone who says that do you believe that we're not calculating the true carbon emissions from ruminants because they recycle the carbon more than they produce? That is, the net production of carbon is overestimated.
Yeah. So this is, I think it was attributed to Frank Mitloner. What this argument does is basically assumes that land is free. So, right, once you've turned a forest into grazing land or you crop land, at that point, you lose this huge amount of carbon. But then after that, of course, the carbon that you use is carbon that's taken up by the plants. So if you ignore the fact that there is this huge cost of the fact that you've had to convert natural land into agricultural land, then you don't seem like you're adding any more carbon. You may be adding methane, but you're not adding more carbon. But in reality, every hectare of land has a huge opportunity cost. And this is particularly true given the fact that we are clearing more forest and savannas and wetlands to meet our rising demand for food. So if we want to stop doing that, we have to basically do everything we can. We have to produce more food in the same land. We have to try to reduce food loss and waste. And we have to hold down the demand for land-intensive foods. And that includes all meats, but it above all includes beef. And the reason essentially is that you're using 10 times at least as many hectares to produce a gram of protein for beef as you are for almost any other food. And that means you're losing that much more carbon. So while I think it's extremely important that efficient beef producers continue to produce beef, and that I spend more time, I personally spend a huge amount of time on trying to improve beef production systems so that they produce less methane, use less land. We're not going to get rid of beef, but we have to hold down the demand for beef.
Thanks a lot, Tim. We have a couple more questions in the chat box, but for the sake of time, we're going to have to move on. But if either Professor Lal or Dr. Searchinger would like to respond in the chat box, please feel free, but we'll make sure that they get the questions and they reply back in due course. So colleagues, I would like to thank immensely our keynote speaker, our feature address, for doing such great presentations to get our symposium started. So thank you very, very much, Professor Lal and Professor Searchinger. I know that you have to go off and teach, and so good luck with your lectures. And we'll ask at this time, since we're running a bit behind time, maybe a quick 5-minute break, and we'll reconvene in 5 minutes. Thank you again, colleagues, for being with us for the next part of our symposium. And we're going to enter into 2 sequential panel discussions where we will bring forward the results, some of the results, a small part of the results of our AGGP program. And so our first panel is going to be an assessment and modeling of ecosystem dynamics. I'm very pleased to introduce the chair of the panel, Professor Ralph Kies of the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology in Germany. His areas of expertise include feedback of global environmental changes on terrestrial ecosystems and biosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere exchange of environmental important trace substances, measurement and mechanistic modeling of carbon and nitrogen turnover and associated fluxes in natural and managed ecosystems. He's published widely in the measurement and modeling of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, and is very eminently qualified to chair this panel. He will be assisted by Dr. Geneviève Grenon, a postdoctoral fellow with our Water Innovation Lab. And so our format is that Ralph will introduce each speaker just by their name. Each speaker will then give a 3 to 5 minute presentation. And we ask that you hold all the questions for the end of all the presentations. And then Professor Kies will invite the audience to participate. And once again, you can use the chat box or the reaction button on Zoom to ask your questions. And Dr. Grenon, as the rapporteur, will also be monitoring the chat in case you use that for your questions. So please use either feature as we go forward. So Ralph, welcome. Very glad that you're able to join us from Germany at such a late time of the day for you, but very pleased you're here, and I will hand over to you, please.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me, and it's actually not too late. So we have a time difference of 6 hours. But just looking on the program, I think we have quite exciting talks. For me, it's very exciting because we had quite difficult names, and I excuse already. It seems to be easy to announce your names, but I'm quite sure I will do mistakes. We start directly with the first speaker, which is Aiden Dasena, and he will report on understanding greenhouse gas hotspots from the rhizosphere, a microbial perspective. The floor is yours, Aiden.
Hi, everyone. Today I just would like to talk about my research that I presented. Give me 1 second. So microbial hotspots occupy almost every niche found in nature, from thermal vents on the sea floor to your own gut. Due to favorable growing conditions, the activity of the rich, diverse microbiome in these niches is orders of magnitude greater than its surroundings. So hotspots are common in agricultural soils because cultivation of crops creates a conducive environment around plant roots for the microbiome, known as the rhizosphere. Here, exudates from plant roots as well as nitrogen fertilizer provide energy-rich substrates and nutrients for rhizosphere microorganisms. However, while microbes in these rhizosphere hotspots produce essential plant nutrients, their activity also generates potent greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide via microbial respiration of the root exudates and reactive nitrogen forms. Despite only occupying around 1% of the soil volume, hotspots like these produce 10 to 100 times more greenhouse gases than bulk soil, accounting for up to 36% of agriculturally derived greenhouse gases and contributing to global climate change. The greenhouse gases released by rhizosphere hotspots depend on the microorganisms actively metabolizing root exudates and reactive nitrogen. Thus, we must identify the key microbes that produce greenhouse gases before we can manage soil hotspots to control emissions. My name is Aiden DeSena, and the objective of my research was to understand carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide emissions from rhizosphere hotspots of ryegrass by resolving the effects of root exudates and urea, a common nitrogen fertilizer, and stimulating specific microorganisms to produce greenhouse gases in this unique niche. We hypothesized that root-associated microorganisms of ryegrass, like genera of Pseudomonadaceae and Bocolduriaceae, would be largely responsible for greenhouse gas emissions from root exudates, while ammonia oxidizing bacteria and archaea like genera of Thamra archaeota and Nitrosomonas and Nitrospira will be responsible for nitrous oxide emissions from urea. In order to test this hypothesis, we needed to apply 13 carbon and 15 nitrogen RNA stable isotope probing and metatranscriptomics. We used 13 carbon and 15 nitrogen labeled urea and root exudates. For root exudates, while 13 carbon is relatively simple to incorporate into plants via 13 carbon dioxide pulse labeling, we had to identify the best method to introduce 15 nitrogen into ryegrass that would increase the 15 nitrogen concentration in root exudates without adding nitrogen to the soil. So we tested leaf tip feeding and stem infiltration with either urea or ammonium nitrate at 3 different concentrations, and found that leaf tip feeding with 0.04% nitrogen ammonium nitrate increased the nitrogen content of ryegrass root exudates by 11%. Now we're in the process of applying this method along with 13 carbon dioxide pulse labeling to pinpoint the archaea and bacteria metabolizing root exudates as well as urea, while also actively transcribing greenhouse gas producing genes. By determining the microorganisms most responsible for carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide emissions, we can develop management practices to target their activities and include the management of microbial hotspot emissions in the climate smart future of agriculture. Thank you so much.
Professor Keys, I can't hear you.
Ralph, you have to kindly start.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, thanks for the interesting first talk. So we move on to the second talk, which is given by Januka Svanna-Tilake from Dalhousie University, and she will report on her work on modeling greenhouse gas emissions in dairy farms under different water and forage management systems. And this is a case study in Nova Scotia in Canada.
Hi everyone, this is about project on modeling greenhouse gas emissions in dairy farms under different water management systems, a case in Nova Scotia. Different water management practices influence greenhouse gas emissions because of their control of soil microbial activity and substrate supply. Soil moisture content, which is controlled by irrigation in most agricultural soils, plays a vital role in modulating the release and consumption of greenhouse gases. This study was designed to investigate the effects of different water management systems on greenhouse gas emissions in dairy farming with the 4 specific objectives listed here. The study site was Dalhousie Agricultural Farm. A random effect model was executed to investigate the effects of water management practices on greenhouse gas emissions. Using milk data from phase 2, fat percentages, protein percentages, and energy corrected milk values were calculated. The HOLOS model was assessed to identify the sources of greenhouse gas emissions within the farm. An online survey was conducted to gauge dairy farmers' attitudes towards adopting the subsurface irrigation system and determine which factors caused their attitude. Econometric results show that subsurface irrigation lowered the CO2 emissions by 24% compared to the natural pasture. According to the HOLOS modeling, by pasturing the dairy cows during the summer months, enteric methane increases by 1 metric ton. Milk data analysis shows that cows being on the irrigated pasture did not improve the milk value compared to the natural and drained pasture types. The survey results show that half of the respondents would be willing to install the subsurface irrigation system if the government paid that at least their half of the cost. We recommend to compare 3 types of fields: natural, drained and irrigated for emissions, measure gas fluxes with the NIVER sensors used at McGill, measure gas fluxes from runoff ditches and holding pond, include more animals in weekly milk tests, measure feed intake and feed type when the animals are not on the pasture, and finally investigate other models in addition to HOLOS model as follow-up studies. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. So we continue with the next presentation given by Kosoluchukwu Ekwunife. She is a PhD student from McGill University, and she will share her work with us on greenhouse gas emissions from frozen agricultural soils.
Hi, everyone. The title of my presentation is Greenhouse Gas Emissions from Frozen Soils in Canada, US, North Atlantic region. My name is Kosoluchukwu Ekwunife, a PhD candidate in the Bioresource Engineering Department of McGill University. So I'll start with a little introduction. Previous studies have investigated how agronomic practices such as water management, crop rotation, fertilizer management could be better managed to mitigate nitrous oxide emissions. However, in cold regions such as the North Atlantic regions of the US and Canada, substantial nitrous oxide emissions occur over winter during the non-growing season, that is around late November and April. And these emissions have not been adequately investigated as studies tend to focus on growing season emissions. One reason for this is the difficulty in collecting gas samples during winter. A review of past studies that we conducted showed that these overwinter emissions could range from 5 to 91% of the total annual emissions. Therefore, the objectives of our study were to, 1, quantify the magnitude of the non-growing season, otherwise called freeze-store nitrous oxide emissions in southern Quebec. The second was to investigate the drivers of these freeze-store emissions. And for these 2 objectives, we made use of measured data, and we also used 2 models. The first was the simultaneous heat and water model called the SHORE model, and the second was the denitrification and decomposition model, also called the DNDC model. The third objective was to quantify the effectiveness of some management practices in reducing the freeze-store emissions. The management practices investigated were nitrification and urease inhibitors. The second and the third were the no-till and the use of cover crops. For this objective, we used meta-analysis, and we had 8 comparisons in all. Now we go back to the results section. With the models calibrated and validated, we see from the top right figure that the peak N2O fluxes occurred around late fall and early spring. We also see that these overwinter fluxes were significant, and there were about 39.3% for the spring top period, that's around March and April, and about 59.5% for the total winter period. We also see from the results of the Shaw model that the peak fluxes were influenced by the soil liquid ice dynamics. It was also influenced by soil temperature and the presence of snow cover. Lastly, we look at the results of the meta-analysis. No-till and the use of nitrification and urease inhibitors significantly reduced winter emissions by 28% and 23% respectively. The effect of cover crops treatment in reducing the emissions, on the other hand, was not significant. This was mainly because we found that the effect size of the mitigation practices differed with climatic regions and soil types. So, for instance, the cold, dry soil, such as those found in Western Canada, could prevent cover crops from being fully established in some years. This thereby hampers this mitigation practice effectiveness in reducing N2O emissions in those regions. On that note, I would like to thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for your nice presentation. So we move on to the next speaker, which is Chi-Yu Hung from McGill University. He is a postdoctoral fellow, and he will report on his work dealing with the spring nitrous oxide emissions under climate change in southern Quebec, Canada.
Hello, everyone. We all know that climate change is expected to intensify soil beetle effects in cold, humid, temperate regions, which increasing nitrous oxide emission from agricultural soils. A solution is to establish cover crop that absorb reactive nitrogen compounds from soil and which could reduce nitrous oxide emissions. But adding manure that contains reactive nitrogen might increase the nitrous oxide emission in future climate scenarios. The objective of my study is to estimate soil nitrous oxide emissions in the spring freeze-thaw period for agricultural soils with cover crops and manuring. I used the DNDC model forced by recent past baseline conditions and by two possible future climate scenarios. The DNDC model was calibrated and validated with data from a 2-year field study in St. Anne-de-Bellevue, Quebec, Canada. Climatic conditions were set with nearby meteorological station data and two bias-adjusted simulations from two represented concentration pathways for 0.5 and 8.5. After validation, the DNDC model could reliably simulate many environmental properties such as soil temperature, soil water, cover crop biomass, and the temporal pattern of nitrous oxide fluxes, but overestimate the spring nitrous oxide emissions. In the future warmer climate, unsurprisingly, there was more cover crop biomass without additional nitrous oxide emission from soil in the spring freeze-thaw period. However, bare soil could not buffer the reactive nitrogen supplied by full applied solid manure, leading a higher estimated nitrous oxide emission from soil with solid manure than with liquid manure or no manure in the two future climate scenarios. Also, we found that cover crops were responsible for a 2 to 5-fold reduction in nitrous oxide emissions, especially in soil receiving solid manure. We therefore recommend planting more fall cover crops to prevent nitrous oxide loss from agricultural soils after fall manure applications.
Thank you for your presentation. We come to the next presentation, which is given by Naeem Abbasi from McGill University. He was at McGill University, but he is currently a research assistant at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, so to be very precise here. And he will talk on mitigating agricultural greenhouse gas emissions through nature-based solutions and artificial intelligence.
Good morning. Today, I'm going to speak to you about mitigating agricultural greenhouse gas emissions through nature-based solutions and artificial intelligence. Cow manure has been used as a primary fertilizer for crop growth for centuries. But after the Green Revolution and innovation in synthetic fertilizers, we started to fully rely on synthetic fertilizer. It's like saying humans can stop eating food now and they can live on supplements like vitamin C, B, D, and protein powders, etc. Now, using synthetic fertilizers only produces high amounts of yield, but it comes at the cost of lower biodiversity in soils and higher nitrous oxide emissions. My research showed that if we use solid cow manure as a primary fertilizer and supplement it with synthetic fertilizers, we can reduce total nitrous oxide emissions by 25% compared to using synthetic fertilizer only. It also increases soil organic matter by 28%. Furthermore, if we combine these practices with innovative water management systems like controlled drainage and sub-irrigation systems, we can reduce these N2 emissions by more than 50%, which is incredible. Now, modeling has been one of the most important tools to predict and forecast environmental pollutants like greenhouse gas emissions, in our case, carbon dioxide emissions from soils. Mechanistic models have been used in the past. So what we did is we took 2 mechanistic models and 6 machine learning models, and we compared their performance. You can see the results are very clear. The DNDC shows 0.22 R-square value in case of cattle manure, whereas random forest, which is a classical machine learning model, shows that R-square value can be achieved as high as 0.94, which is incredible. These machine learning models overcome the limitations that are given by biophysical models. And they overcome the complexity that is introduced by nature-based solutions like cattle manure, which introduces higher organic matter, higher macronutrients to the soil. Therefore, with nature-based solutions and artificial intelligence, we can really help mitigate these greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural soils. With that, I would like to say thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you for your presentation with quite significant reduction potentials, so quite high numbers here. Before we come to the discussion, we come to the last speaker of the session, who is Qianqing Yang. He is also a former student and research associate of McGill and is currently associated with Shenyang University. And he will talk on global warming potential of water management practices for intensive crop production under changing climate.
Hi, my name is Chen Jing. The title of my presentation is Global Warming Potential of Water Management Practices for Intensive Crop Production under a Changing Climate. The goals of my research were, firstly, to evaluate the performance of the improved DNDC model to estimate the greenhouse gas emissions from different water management and cropping systems in eastern Canada. Second, to predict the global warming potential of these water management systems and associated changes in soil organic carbon under a changing climate. To achieve these goals, the DNDC model, which is a process-based model, was employed. The model was calibrated and validated against measured N2O and CO2 emissions from four. Hi, my name is Chen Jing. The title of my presentation is Global Warming Potential of Water Management Practices for Intensive Crop Production under a Changing Climate. The goals of my research were, firstly, to evaluate the performance of the improved DNDC model to estimate the greenhouse gas emissions from different water management and cropping systems in eastern Canada. Second, to predict the global warming potential of these water management systems and associated changes in soil organic carbon under a changing climate. To achieve these goals, the DNDC model, which is a process-based model, was employed. The model was calibrated and validated against measured N2O and CO2 emissions from 4 sites. Then long-term future climate data projected from several climate models were applied to the baseline scenarios to estimate the future global warming potentials and greenhouse gas emissions. After the model was successfully calibrated and validated, it shows a consistent trend of greater annual N2O and CO2 emissions in the future. The global warming potentials are predicted to decrease in the corn and soybean rotated fields, but increase in the onion and tomato fields in the future. Our simulations show that water table control with subrogation may decrease the global warming potential by allowing greater soil organic carbon sequestration. So here are the 5 key findings of this study. First, the controlled drainage with subrogation is necessary to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and reduce global warming potential. Second, sprinkler irrigation contributes to greater global warming potential due to increased N2O and CO2 emissions. However, it has a negligible impact on soil organic carbon. Third, compared to surface drip irrigation, subsurface drip irrigation is effective to reduce the global warming potential and increase crop yield. Fourth, climate change results in increased N2O and CO2 emissions under all water treatments. Fifth, the future global warming potential will decrease slightly under a corn-soybean rotation, but increase under vegetable production systems. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks for your presentation. So we are ready for discussions and wrap up, and I would like to ask the audience for questions. There's one question to Naeem. So the question is, how did you handle potential overfitting with the random forest model?
Hi, so thank you for that question. Essentially, we optimize the models with Bayesian equations, and me and my co-authors work on it so that we handle overfitting and we're not overestimating or over adjusting the models. So we did quite a bit of work, and actually that paper is actually coming out next week. It's in publication now, so I'll share the publication as soon as it comes out. I hope that helps. Thank you.
I may continue with a question for you, Naeem, because you made a clear point looking on your statistics that the random forest model machine learning tools are superior to process-based models. But can you just tell us a bit more what kind of data you used and what would be your expectations if you would take a random forest model to kind of similar systems which might deviate a bit from your data where you just fitted the model? Because it was a very general statement, and I'm not sure if it fits just for, let's say, a case study, but the question is how transferable it is, and what would you say then about advantages, disadvantages of process-based model versus random forest?
This reminds me of all the questions that I got from my reviewers when I was trying to publish the book. Yes, there are differences between mechanistic and machine learning models. In machine learning models, we have basically the independence or the freedom to choose the input parameters based on their biophysical connection to the output parameter. So that helps, and that's kind of a advantage over the biophysical models. What we used was soil parameters, and we used climate parameters like rain, temperatures, maximum, minimum, sunshine, then soil organic matter, and we also use some scenarios like inorganic fertilizer and solid Kelvin manure. So that essentially helps bumping up modeling efficiency. Whereas in biophysical models, you need a certain set of parameters, and if you don't have those, the model might not work. So that's the freedom and flexibility that I think is more important from artificial intelligence models. And I think the next thing is that applicability is surely not as general as biophysical models, because the input parameters can be chosen. So we can make the model that we made as a general model and give it to everybody to put these in and get good results. But for applicability in different disciplines, different other kind of pollutants, we will have to, to start from the beginning, where we know the connections between the biophysical connection between the pollutant and what those factors are that are causing it. So yes, applicability in terms of a general sense is much less, unless you're starting from the bottom. So that's kind of a disadvantage into it. But I'm quite excited with the results so far.
Good. Thanks for your nice answer. So I think was quite good for the audience to reflect a little bit on this. Is there more questions to other talks, general questions? If this is not the case, I'm just looking also a bit on the time. So I try to wrap up a little bit as much as is possible from the different talks. I think what we have seen is that most people looked on N2 emissions, but that maybe holds also for methane emissions, that the tricky part is that we have this hot spot. So the first talk was on rhizospheres, which is just kind of spatial hotspots of emissions. But we have also this hot moment like the frost thaw or irrigation. So that makes the behaving of N2 emissions like flat lines, and then we have all these peaks and makes it pretty tricky for mitigation. So what we have seen also with the talks, which I find quite interesting, that so far our research is just linking measurements with models. And because we have these hot spots and we have these hot moments, we also see, and this is going back maybe to the low R square, that these process-based models like the NDC are okay for describing general patterns, but maybe not so good for the hotspots and the hot moments. And so we just need more knowledge, like looking also into microbial communities and environmental changes and linkages of substrates with the communities and so on to better understand this. So, and that is necessary also for the mitigation, because the mitigation we need to do finally or assess with models, because we need to extrapolate this point measurement from point scale to regional national scales. And what we have seen, particularly for methane, there's hot moments and hot spots like the rhizosphere, but there's different compartments in the landscape, like we have streams, ditches, and the pastures, and all of them can be important. And we are kind of sectorially nicely estimating greenhouse gas emissions from fields, from ditches, but a kind of landscape analysis is not so common. And I think there's also research needs to see at what places in the landscape we have the highest mitigation potential. There was talk summarizing global warming potential, so we need to combine methane, N2O, and CO2 emissions just to also see where we have the highest potential in terms of reducing. Carbon sequestration was also in the previous talks a very important one for mitigation. And then we see this artificial intelligence coming in, and I think this is quite beneficial, because we can use this to see if there's convergences or divergences of this process-based models and artificial intelligence approaches, and we can learn from each other, which finally will make the both approaches better in terms of predicting. And so from that point of view, we have data on different scales. We need to improve the processes, but we have more in the basket than this process-based models, also kind of statistical approaches. And with that, I think, we might can take steps forward.
Ralph, I see Kevin Wade has commented that you've made a nice summary. I hope you can give it to us when you're finished so we can put it into the conference proceedings. So thank you. Very, very well done. And thank you very much to you, Genevieve, as the rapporteur, and to the presenters. And I would now like to suggest that we take a 5-minute break and we reconvene in 5 minutes, so we can have a bit of a stretch. And Professor Brent Swallow will join us as the chair of the panel on framing approaches to greenhouse gas reductions in a circular economy. Let's join back in about 5 minutes maximum, please. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Vyacheslav Adamchuk, and I will talk about sensor systems development. Proximal soil sensing is an area of research when systems being built to measure soil properties when located at a distance less than 2 meters to the target. There are a variety of sensor options that have been built around the world to measure different soil properties. However, what was found that many properties affect more than one sensor in with different way. Therefore, the trend in this research is combining different sensor systems in one system. When we're considering all the options available today, many sensors are focusing on physical soil properties, some on chemical soil properties, but very few on biological soil properties. One of the first sensor development projects was to use K30 CO2 sensor to measure change in CO2 concentration as affected by substrate induction, such as adding glucose to the soil. First interested, as shown on this graph, this substrate induction changes the rate of increase in CO2 concentration as compared to soil that has low biological activity. Further to this, if we're looking at autoclave soil as compared to control soil, even without glucose, we also can see the difference, but adding glucose makes the difference much more apparent. And this change is different for different type of soil based on organic The most common way to measure CO2 fluxes is using static chambers. So the next step was to see if we can use the same K30 sensor to measure change of CO2 concentration in a short period of time. And this system also can be used for subtract induction, but adding air pump allows us to extract air from the soil pores and measure change of CO2 concentration as a result of that extraction. As an example of following that procedure, if we are looking at an agricultural site with organic mineral soil, we can clearly see that increase in CO2 concentration inside the chamber is much higher at organic soil versus mineral soil. In controlled experiment, we also looked at the effect of soil compaction with adding glucose, without glucose, and using different level of soil moisture. So it's clearly can see that the change of air pressure when we extract air from the soil is different depending on compact. But in moisture also affects soil to increase change of concentration. So the higher moisture, the more bacterial activity we experience. And further to that, if we add glucose, again, that change is more apparent. Further development led us to establishment of a wireless sensor network using the same NDR CO2 sensors. And these sensors have been compared against GC used as standard and as benchmark instrument. And the relationship has been shown quite strong. Once you have the network, you can locate those sensors anywhere within a few hundred meters area and simultaneously obtain CO2 flux measurements from all of the locations. If those locations show different cultural practices, different treatments, then we can rapidly assess if there is a difference in terms of CO2 emission on those sites. Our next step is to use those sensors for on-the-spot analysis of soil using automated platform. Combine this with optical sensors, whether commercial or some of the prototypes that we've also been building, looking at soil spectroscopy and assess multiple soil properties at the same time. Or as the newest prototype that became part of this physical properties mapping system designed for autonomous platform, has a CO2 concentration and air injection sensor, which looks like this. And in this situation, we have ability to assess both porosity and concentration of CO2 in the soil in real time from near surface conditions. So in the summary, spatial and temporal variability of soil biological health is important, and soil microbial population changes significantly across one agricultural landscape. Relationship with physical and soil chemical properties exists, but it's a complex one, and mapping soil respiration is an attractive approach to assess those differences in soil biological activities. So using those CO2 sensors, we can measure change in the bacterial respiration rate from either extracted soil or using substrate-induced activity, or using just a regular passive assessment of CO2 flux. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hi everyone, my name is Latif Mohammed, a master's candidate at the University of Saskatchewan. Today, I'll be presenting to you on economic analysis of yield estimation and future climate change scenarios in Eastern Canada, that is in Quebec and Ontario, using the DSAT model approach. I would also like to state that this is actually a work in progress and it is not the final work of my thesis. Global climate change caused by natural events and human activities is almost a certainty. Climate change affects all sectors in the economy, and agricultural sector is perhaps the most sensitive and vulnerable sector. This is because climate change affects crop yield in many ways and farming activities. Due to these reasons, concerns about the negative effects of climate change on crop yield and agricultural production have been justified, and farmers need to adjust to these changes in the climate. Due to this, beneficial water management practices have been developed by the Canadian government to help water use efficiency are necessary, not only to mitigate GHG emissions, but also to provide a higher yield that increase the profitability of farmers in Quebec and Ontario. In this study, one, to estimate crop yield for both the BMP technology and the base technologies under future climate change projections. The base technology is actually what the farmers are practicing, and the BMP technology, which is controlled drainage, is what we are proposing. And two, to perform financial analysis to determine the desirability of both technologies under future climate change projections. The methodology that is used in this work is the DSAT model, which is designed to simulate the growth, development, and yield of single crops, as well as changes in soil water. It's also used in predictions of climate change impact on crop production and environmental impact of agricultural activities. So this is how the DSAT model looks like. The blue shapes here represent the input requirement for running the DSAT model, and the DSAT is able to predict plant growth, plant development, and yield under the BMP and the base technology. So we require the soil data, the crop management data, the weather data, and genetic coefficients in running the DSAT model. Economics of the BMPs and the base technology. Now, after estimating the yield of the various crops from the DSAT model, we perform a financial analysis to determine the desirability of the two technologies. In this case, we use the net present value, the benefit cost ratio, and the internal rate of returns as our main tools to perform the financial analysis. In this sense, the private economic net benefit to the farmer through the adoption of new water management technology was estimated by calculating the benefit and cost related to the selected BMP technology and comparing that to a situation where the farmer did not accept or did not adopt the BMP technology. But this research was collected from the Environment and Climate Change Canada, especially the weather data, and then the financial analysis data was also collected from previous publications of the AGGP project. Said from the beginning, this is actually a work in progress, so we had some expected outcomes, and selected BMP technology have already been estimated to be more desirable than the base technology, and that is the work conducted by Mariala However, her study did not include future climate change projections. This current study takes into account future climate change projections to see what happens to crop yield when climate change in the future. So it is expected that the selected BMP would be much desirable under future climate change projections. Thank you very much. This is what I have for you.
Good afternoon. My name is Soren Kulshrest. I'm going to make a presentation on this economic analysis of BMPs for water table management in Ontario and Quebec. Water availability is going to be under pressure because of the climate change and increased competition. Therefore, there is a need for water management. Beneficial practices have been developed already. The question remains, would the producer adopt them? To find out, the literature review suggests that the economic returns are important in this context. So the objective of this study is to look at the economic desirability of adopting selected BMPs. And BMPs that we have tested are in 4 areas, 4 study sites. We have in Harrow, we have in Holland Marsh, we have in Saint Emmanuel, and we have in Sherrington. And the BMPs are in Saint Emmanuel controlled drainage with sub-irrigation. We have in Harrow the same. In Sherrington, we have hand-moved sprinkler irrigation, and in Holland Marsh controlled drainage. Analytical framework, we developed a financial analysis which included net present value, benefit cost ratio, and the payback period. So I'm going to show you the results for in 3 different slides. One is that for corn and soybean rotation, the net present value does increase by about $40 an acre, but the benefit cost ratio is very close to 1. And the payback period for the initial investment, it takes almost 19 years. And therefore the technology is not all that attractive to the people. The same thing for Harrow, we found that it adds about $28 per acre, no change in the benefit cost ratio, and it takes about 20 years for a farmer to recuperate the initial investment. When we look for the carrot onions, the vegetable, the technology is very attractive. The net present values increased by about almost $5,000. The benefit cost ratio is 2.1 or slightly over. And it only takes between 1 and 2 years for the payback period for the investment to be recovered. When we looked at the Holland Marsh, the same story, about $4,000 an acre improvement in the net present value of the farmer. 1.6 is the benefit cost ratio, and it takes less than a year for the farmer to recuperate the investment in technology. So basically our conclusion is that the selected BMP technology for each of the 4 cases studied was a more desirable alternative than the conventional or the base technology. The technology is better or more attractive in vegetable production than in grain production. For the grain production sites, the payback period is long, and therefore people are not, or the farmers are not going to be attracted to this technology, but such is not the case with the vegetable production. We also undertook some sensitivity analysis, and the conclusion did not change.
Agriculture is a major source of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. It also has the potential to be a huge carbon sink, making it an important sector towards mitigation efforts. To mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, environmental economics typically employs tax and subsidy incentives to modify market signals towards investment in green technologies and to make pollution less attractive. Although these incentives do reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they are, 1, expensive per ton of greenhouse gas equivalent reduced, and they jeopardize food production efforts. We know that food security is also a major concern. Thus, it is imperative that we come up with mitigation efforts or measures, strategies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions without jeopardizing our food production potential. My name is Mfon Essien, and the title of my presentation is Identifying Cost-Competitive Greenhouse Gas Mitigation Potential of Canadian Agriculture. The objective of my study is, first of all, to construct an engineering marginal abatement cost curve, or a bottom-up approach for Canadian agriculture that incorporates uncertainty, and to employ this engineering marginal abatement cost curve to identify cost-effective mitigation strategies and measures in Canadian context. So the first step in an engineering marginal abatement cost curve, or the bottom-up approach, is to ascertain or set boundary analysis. So in this case, the spatial boundary would be in the Canadian context, and the sectorial boundary would be Canadian agriculture, crop production, on-farm crop production. The second would be the reference scenario. So we are going to be using both for sensitivity analysis purposes, both the Canadian baseline scenario and the IPCC 2015 baseline, IPCC inventory baseline scenario as well. Then we select mitigation measures. So to select mitigation measures, I screened over 40 measures, but narrowed it down to 10 measures, or included 10 measures that are relevant in the Canadian context and do not jeopardize food production, even when they reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Then I quantified the abatement rate of the selected measures. I estimated the implementation cost of these measures, and then I calculated the difference between the baseline scenario from Canada and the cost effectiveness scenario, assuming these mitigation measures are put in place. Our results show that nutrient management is a crucial component towards greenhouse gas reduction. So whether it's split fertilizer application, right time, right placement, or right product, all of this and together, an interaction of them are very important towards mitigation efforts. Another measure that is important, equally important, but the importance is seen more when it's coupled with fertilizer management, is water management. For example, controlled drainage, when coupled with fertilizer management, is very beneficial towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. However, as a standalone, some of the studies that I reviewed showed that it's inconclusive. Then some measures such as nitrifying inhibitors or grassland buffer strips do reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but at a very high cost to agriculture. So these are some of the measures that would need further research. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to present this research with the title of Co-Benefits of Climate Change Mitigation from Innovative Agricultural Water Management, a case study of corn agri-ecosystem in Eastern Canada. With the increasing attention concerning the impacts of climate change in agriculture, beneficial water management practices have been identified to decrease GHG emissions from the crop production process. Notably, the adoption of such practices simultaneously may also generate other benefits for the society, including the producers, commonly called co-benefits. Co-benefits of climate change mitigation were proposed in the first assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as benefits of policies that are implemented for various reasons at the same time, including climate change mitigation. The incorporation of co-benefits has introduced a critical path to achieve the dual goals of reducing GHG emissions and pollutants with lower costs, and that significantly change the outcome of economic assessment of the GHG mitigation policy. Understanding and evaluation of such co-benefits of BWMPs can be of high necessity for decision makers to understand the overall gains in society's well-being by the adoption of such practices by individual producers. Although such associated benefits of the innovative water management system may not be the initial target of climate change mitigation, such knowledge will be linked to the development of efficient policy measures regarding climate change mitigation and adaptation. The objective of this research is to conduct a quantitative evaluation of the level of co-benefits from the implementation of innovative agricultural water management based on a case study for the corn agri-ecosystem in Eastern Canada. The study farm was located in Seattle, Quebec, which has a total area of 100 hectares, and the study field consisted of 4.2 hectares. The data for conducting financial analysis regarding the adoption of BWMPs in study farm contains 3 primary categories: investment costs for implementing the water management system. The second, revenues based on crop yield and price. And the third one, operating costs involving inputs and fixed costs. The environmental impacts of BWMPs in this study were estimated using a life cycle assessment framework for both technologies, BWMPs and the base technology. Table 1 illustrates a summarized co-benefits per hectare of BWMPs in comparison with base technology for a continuous corn production system during the system's lifespan in Eastern Canada. The change of net present values of investing in BWMPs compared with base technology was $98.84 per acre in Canadian dollars in 2019. This value calculating with the environment benefits, which is about 128.72 per acre, resulted in a total benefits value of $227.56 per acre. Although a producer will not internalize these environmental benefits as private economic return, policymakers must be aware of these co-benefits and consider them in developing policies for the adoption of BWMPs. The existence of co-benefits, particularly those resulting from reduced adverse environmental impacts, makes a case for the provision of incentives. In conclusion, aside from GHG emissions mitigation, innovative water management also generate extra values through the evaluation of co-benefits under the protection of climate change, which poses our threat to crop production in Eastern Canada. Adapting agricultural water management to climate change by adopting BWMPs is of increasing necessity. Thank you for listening.
So I guess I have a question. I have some comments to make at the end as well, but just a question now for the last presenter, and perhaps Surend is on the line for her as well, is about the co-benefits. That was interesting to hear about these large co-benefits. I didn't really follow enough to understand what are the co-benefits that are most important. I certainly understand your issue about the policy importance, but are there co-benefits that could be internalized some other way through if there are other beneficiaries other than the farmer and the general public for some of the co-benefits? Are there other ways that they might be incented to also help finance those co-benefits?
Thank you for your question. I think for this question, the origin design for all this beneficial water management practice is to reduce GHG emissions, but also it has other benefits regarding one important one is it has some benefits to improve yields, the stability of water management, as well as an important water management in farmland. It has great benefits in to improve the soil quality and water quality, like reduce the nitrogen loading and phosphorus loading. So all these environment benefits combining with the economic benefits to the private farm, we combine it as a co-benefits of this technology, aside from the mitigation of climate change or the GHG emission of this technology. So that's the how co-benefits of this technology include.
Thank you. It's interesting use of the word co-benefit, where you're thinking about the public investment toward the public good of reducing GHG emissions, producing private benefits as co-benefits. So I'm not used to that framing of it, but that's very clear. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have other questions from the overall group? So maybe I'll ask a question, just looking at, I have to be careful of the time. Just one last question, I guess, maybe to Surend. Did that surprise you, the results that you found with Mariella about the low benefit cost ratio in the water management practices for some systems and quite different for other systems. How do you build upon those results?
Well, basically, Brian, what we found is in the case of grain production or crop production, the yield differences are not there. We need the kind of crops, we need the kind of varieties that will lead to a better improvement in the crop yield. The vegetables are more susceptible, more sensitive to the availability of the moisture, and they're showing the net benefit to the producers.
Good. Thank you.
I think I could add to that too, Brent, if you wish. And, you know, one of the things about corn, soybean production is that they're quite more drought resistant than we think they are, especially here in Eastern Canada, where, you know, we get over 1,200 millimeters of precipitation a year, something like 40% of it occurs during the growing season. So it's just enough moisture, natural precipitation, enough natural moisture to be able to carry the crop through, that we don't see the big yield differences, except in a very dry year. And Suren can probably comment on that, because we have had very dry years where the difference is so much more that it pays then for sub-irrigation or controlled drainage. But really, it's the vegetable crops that are very shallow rooted, more susceptible to moisture, that would benefit more.
So thanks, Chandra. Chandra, should I just do a couple wrap-up comments now? Is
Yes.
that appropriate? Okay.
Yeah, please do.
Just a few comments from me. One is, so I am somewhat familiar with this literature from here in Canada as well as internationally from my previous incarnation as a scientist in the CG system. One thing I just maybe note for everyone is the use of the term circular economy that is in the title to our panel. And I think this is, though not really advertised as such, I think there's lots of cool evidence of the importance of the circular economy approaches from this whole session, thinking about the soils in detail, right? And what are the soil processes that are affected by cropping and different management practices, and understanding that to a deeper level than we've perhaps had before, which is really interesting. Also thinking about things like co-benefits, this last presentation, that we really need to think about what does the market capture? And this is back a little bit to the introductory presentation by Ratan Lal, is that we have to think about what's valued and the difference, how do we value carbon, as well as how are we valuing soils, and how the market, what signals do we get from the markets about what's valued? And that's helps us to link things together. And we have to think, as Rand mentioned, we have to think kind of about this broader set of benefits when we think about policy. But part of that policy might be market-oriented policy as well. So that's just kind of a importance of the circular economy perspective. The other thing I guess I say is I really like the combination of really micro level studies, which are important to understand farmers' perspectives, as well as the more macro and aggregate level studies that we got, for example, from MFON. Important for us to think about these solutions in this broader context as part of Canada's overall approach to addressing climate change and trying to meet, at least move further toward meeting our Paris commitments. We have, a cool new article by Ronnie Drever and many colleagues who look at nature-based solutions for climate change in Canada and really find agriculture to be very important. The one thing that they find is this prevention or protection of land, which our other keynote speaker talked about as being important. And the Drever paper also looks at the protection of grasslands as the #1 potential within the agriculture sector to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. And so therefore, we've got this sort of interaction with the rangelands and grassland and animal agriculture policies. So I'll just end there and say thank you very much to all the speakers and to the organizers of the conference. I'll pass back to you, Chandra.
Okay, thank you very, very much for that, Brent. That was a very good summary that you've made, and you've tied in very well the keynote speeches, looking at the breadth of the subject. And yeah, when we did put the program together, we thought about putting this together in terms of the circular economy. Certainly a lot of our professional societies today are writing white papers about the circular economy, what it means in terms of our teaching or research or scholarly work with the community. So I think it's quite apropos that we try to frame this, especially as we move towards a more decarbonized economy in our agricultural economy. So thank you very, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of the formal part of the presentations. And so the floor is now completely yours to say a few words, ask questions, generally make comments. All comments are welcome. We want to use these comments and remarks to move forward into the next phase of work that we're planning. So please feel free to raise your hand and speak. But before I do that, I would like to, first of all, I have sent him some a sort of a pre-warning to my colleague, Kevin Wade, who is an animal scientist here in our Department of Animal Science at McGill. And he has worked long and hard in the dairy sector, and probably appreciates some of the comments that were made by Tim Searchinger with respect to enteric greenhouse gases and trying to limit those gases, as they're the largest greenhouse gases in agriculture. So Kevin, any comments that you would like to make?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, very well.
So
I know I've caught you off guard, but I gave you like a 2-minute warning.
Thanks for putting me on the spot. Apologies that I'm not displaying my cam this morning. Decided not to work for some reason, so you'll have to put up with my image. I'm not an expert in this area. I was here to learn as much as I could, and I think it was a great session. I think it's more of what we actually need to do. I think as researchers, we often tend to work in our own silos, whether it's animals or plant or soil. And I think something like this that makes us look at the whole system, starting with the soil, going to the pasture, forage, whether it's used for human or for animal production, and then on to animal production. I think that's the real way forward if we're to start to look at these production systems in agriculture. And I think then when we look at them as a whole, we'll hopefully start to see some savings as we try to reduce our carbon footprint. So I think I'll leave my comments at that. I think it was a great seminar. Congratulations to all involved. I certainly had some nice take-home messages that I hope to either include in my research or pass on to my students in some of our lectures. So congratulations to all involved, and thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. I was hoping to draw you in a bit more into the debate on enteric release of greenhouse gases, but obviously you're not not tempted.
As I said, it's not really my area of research. I have listened to Frank, and I think Frank has a very good way of getting his ideas across. But as with everything, there seems to be two sides to the story. I do think that animal agriculture seems to get blamed a lot for methane production. And I don't know how much of it is actually involved in the processing afterwards. So when my cow produces her liter of milk, how much of the actual contribution to greenhouse gases is taken from the person who gets into their 4x4 and drives one block to pick up the liter of milk in the supermarket. So I think there's lots of aspects that get thrown into animal agriculture that may not be deserved. And I think it's an interesting proposition that there are other ways to measure contributions of carbon, especially on the ruminant side. I did appreciate the comment that land is not free, but I think we also have to consider that there's lots of parts of the world that are not arable land, where ruminants are playing their role on land that couldn't be used for large-scale arable production. And I think in those parts of the world, from socioeconomic, from political aspects, from cultural aspects, they'll always, animal production will always serve a role there in the production of milk, which is a ubiquitous form of protein that can be, found anywhere in the world. So as with all of these things, there's no black and white answers, but I appreciated the discussion on that.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I think your point is well taken. As we travel around before COVID and visited parts of sub-Saharan Africa where livestock production is taking place on marginal lands that could not be used for intensive crop agriculture, but the meat products are so important, and not just the meat and meat products, even the carcasses and the hides are so important for the economic livelihoods of some of these peoples in some of the drier parts of sub-Saharan Africa. It does point out that it's not a black and white situation. Yes, we need to put this in balance because people's livelihoods are at stake. So good comment. Thank you. I'm going to, before I go to the questions, I know Naeem has his hand up. I'm going to call on the president of ICID, Dr. Ragab, to kindly say a few words. Ragab, please.
Thank you, Professor Chandra. Well, actually, the ICID is International Commission on Irrigation and Drainage. The focus is irrigation and drainage. However, the Commission has a working group on the climate change and the climate change mitigation. And it is looking at a different management practices that would actually reduce the greenhouse gas emission. And it is really one of the largest working group, and the work that you presented today is a very useful for actually the ICID and the working group. I could see from presentations today, subsurface drip irrigation, for example, is a good practice for greenhouse gas emission. I could also see the controlled drainage, also another way of management to mitigate the greenhouse emission. I could actually see also the sensors about the soil bioactivities and the importance of the modeling to project and prevent the greenhouse emission. And also I was really fascinated by the presentation of Professor Lal and about really the soil ability to significantly mitigate the greenhouse emission. Although in ICID we focus more on the water side, but actually that opens our eyes on also the importance and the role that the soil is playing to mitigate the greenhouse gas emission. And also Dr. Timothy also referred to a different agricultural water and agricultural land management, including the grazing, peat and wetlands, in particular, the livestock management and the biofuel. And the biofuel here is another issue that we face, especially, I can talk maybe on about the UK. They are very fast growing crops. They consume a lot of water. And it is, I look at it maybe from the water consumption, but it is now highlighted by Dr. Timothy that it has also a different negative impacts more than the high water consumption. And I think really that there were so many things like the concept of produce, protect, reduce, and restore concept, which really a good message to take home. And I could really see a lot of really benefit, economical benefit. The last few actually presentations highlighted also the economic analysis of mitigation of the greenhouse emission, which also quite a new dimension to take on board. So I could really see a lot of benefits that ICID could use, and especially our working group on climate change can actually see a value in what you presented. It's very excellent presentation, high quality research, and I congratulate you really all for such productive and excellent day of knowledge rich. And I thank you really for giving me the chance to give a few words about ICID. Thank you, Dr. Chandra.
Thank you very much, President Ragab. And we are very grateful to you and to ICID for being a co-sponsor of the event. I know it's getting on later in the day for you, not very late, but
no, it's still okay.
Yeah, still okay. But as usual, Ragab, always a pleasure to hear from you and to have your inputs, very insightful as usual. So thank you very, very much. There are two questions. Aiden has one. Aiden, I'm going to put Naeem first because yours actually ties into some of the comments that I will make as part of my wrap up. So if that's okay with you, Naeem, why don't you unmute yourself and go ahead, please.
Yeah, so I got a little inspired by Tim's comments and Kevin's comments. And since I worked with cows, so I wanted to add some more input into it. I work with cows, and a cow eats about 110 tons of grass in its 20 years of lifespan. That equals to about 200 metric tons of carbon dioxide sequestration. And if we put that into value perspective, we have price is about 25.15 euros per metric ton. So each cow is about providing a service of carbon sequestration that is value about 5,000 euros. And there are 1 billion cows in the world. So that's a $5 trillion value that we are getting from the cows in the world. And if we even assume that 40% of those sequestrations are going back into the atmosphere, we're still left with $3 trillion over the period of 20 years. But the problem is that no cow lives 20 years because it stops giving milk at 6 years, and then it's slaughtered for cheap beef that hamburgers we eat. So that's some food for thought, and that's also a direction to do the research and mathematics to see if this is an externality. Maybe we should bring that value into our economy, and I think this will enrich our economy much better if we start to consider nature as a part of the business instead of an externality. So a food for thought might inspire a few people from this comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Naeem. Very appreciated. And Aiden, why don't you go ahead and pose your question if you unmute yourself. And then from that, I will add a few comments to wrap up. Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess it's just more of a general question, but you know, and it was one of the goals of the agricultural greenhouse gases project, the part 2 of it, the grant. But you know, I do find that while we're making some headway in this, you know, the soil science and the atmospheric science behind greenhouse gas from agriculture works in one silo, and then the economic analysis and the policy analysis work in a separate silo. And, like I said, we made some headway, but I was wondering if anyone has any perspectives of how to better collaborate in our goal to mitigate greenhouse gases coming from agriculture. If anyone has any thoughts.
Thanks, Aidan. Anyone like to respond to Aidan? I see that Christina has seconded your question, Aidan. So Christina, would you like to unmute yourself and speak, please?
Hi, sorry, I was typing up the question while you were all speaking. I didn't think it would take so long. So yeah, I just really appreciate Aidan's question because it is a really obvious problem that not only within our own research fields, we are in our own silos, but yeah, there's a huge disconnect between the science and the policy. And so I give an example here because there was a lot of discussion in the symposium about drained wetlands for agricultural purposes. And this symposium is being hosted by McGill, which is in Quebec, and more than 50% of Quebec's market vegetable economy relies on drained peatlands. And so how do we, we know, as it was mentioned in the symposium, that we need to re-wet soils in order to mitigate the greenhouse gas emissions and obviously restore wetlands, which are incredibly important ecosystems. That it poses a massive problem for the monetary economy and farmers themselves. And so how do we bridge that gap, especially when there are examples that are very successful. I give the example of pollutoculture in Europe, which uses a wetland system to produce food, but that would require a complete revamp of infrastructure that already exists on the cultivated organic soils of Quebec, again, just as an example, since it's close to home. So that someone has to suffer there. So either we're suffering through greenhouse gas emission and destroying wetlands, or our economy suffers. And so how do we get those two groups of people talking to create tangible solutions? Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. Aidan, you worked in a previous life with us on wetland soils in Ontario in the Holland Marsh. So and you've also been out to the areas that Christina's talking about in Charenton and Saint Remy and so on. Based on your experiences, do you want to comment?
Yeah, for sure. And we do have to think about these things, economy, it's not just about money, it's people's livelihoods. And, a lot of farmers depend on, what they make from these lands that have been cultivated since, the Holland Marsh has been cultivated since, heavily cultivated since the 1930s, and has become, what they say of Toronto, it's the vegetable basket of, Toronto. I think it provides 60% of the vegetables, if I remember correctly, to Toronto. So, and that's significant. So we really do have to work very closely and, make sure we can't make decisions that, completely re-wet all these cultivated organic soils. And because then it would have disastrous effects on, the agriculture economy in Canada and worldwide. And that's agriculture is a big part of Canada's economy. And also there's another point in that, we can't even just focus on greenhouse gases, because all of this is, if they found with a lot of those re-wetting studies, at least in Europe, that resuspended all of this phosphorus and caused major eutrophication issues. So again, not just working in silos of, soil science and economy, but also how do we break down pollution, into all these, our effects. If we just focus completely on one pollutant like greenhouse gases, we could be causing other forms of pollution. So we really have to work together as a team, and it requires lots of different expertise to make sure that we're making the right decisions and not creating more disastrous effects.
Yeah, thanks, Aidan. I'll talk about that as I wrap up. But I just wonder if my department chair is still on line. Slava, as department chair and as someone who has worked with us on this project, doing some very innovative work on sensors, do you want to say any words of wrap up on behalf of the department and the university, if you're still there?
I don't think he's here. I don't see him.
Don't see. Okay, he's left. Okay, well, we're also at the time of closure, and I know people are in different parts of the world, and I want to respect our program. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to say what a very rich and rewarding symposium this has been for me. What we did today, we certainly couldn't have done physically, as I was saying earlier to our students. Trying to put this together physically would be such a big task, and all the arrangements and the organization, but we've certainly learned during COVID how to use these different forms of electronic media to bring people together from around the world. And we've had some at the peak today, we had about 80 something participants from around the world, and we still do have others who are still with us, which I think is a testimony to the fact that the technology has enabled us to work and collaborate. I think in summary, the one key point that everyone has brought out today is that we're not working in silos and trying to address greenhouse gas emissions. It's not just the technologies. Yes, we have to do more, Christina and Aidan, with respect to the engineered water management technologies. As we solve one problem, we may be creating another problem. We started out our work in the Holland Marsh trying to address the nitrogen and phosphorus pollution problems. Not completely solved as yet, but we are getting there in our research. But obviously linking the nitrogen and phosphorus water quality problems, using the water table management features of our irrigation and drainage systems to control moisture, control the water table. How can we manage these systems better to deal with emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and water quality management? And we haven't conquered that as yet. We still have lots of work to do there, especially when we look at Koso's presentation with respect to winter emissions, which are going to increase, as we see from the IPCC report. That is something, you know, we've only paid attention to the growing season, but we're going to have to use our engineered systems much more to also deal with winter emissions as well. So there's a lot of work to be done. When we listened to all the presentations today, this is not the end. This is probably the start of something even bigger. And so I think as Brent is just mentioning here, the focusing on produce, protect, and reduce, lower cost than restore. And this is consistent with the paper just published in Science by Drever. So yes, we're just at the start of something new in looking at this in a broader context and bringing in the policy and the economics and the triggers for adoption of practices, best management practices as well. And so that's where we're going to go with this. As you've heard from Michael Hawes at Fulbright, we intend to take this a bit further. We've also been in discussions with our colleagues at FAO on this. And so we hope to do something on a bigger scale as a result of our results today. So thank you everybody for your participation, and we will keep in touch with you. And if at any time you have any comments or questions that you feel we could address, please don't hesitate to email or send them in, and we would be happy to help to work with the speakers to provide responses. So once again, thanks everybody. Kevin, do you have a question, or I see your hand raised?
That was a congratulations. Well done.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. And I would like to say thanks again to everybody, and for all those who presented, all of our speakers. those who helped chair sessions, and for those who worked behind the scenes. As you all know, it couldn't have happened unless we had some diligent, hardworking people behind the scenes making things work on our behalf. So again, my best wishes to everybody, and thanks again for participating wherever you are. And for the record, I should also thank Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada for support of our research work in greenhouse gases. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for the learning opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Chandra.
Thank you, Ragab. Thank you very, very much for doing this for us.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Naeem. You're on mute.
I thought if I leave, everything might just drop. So I will leave.
No, I'm still there. Primary will say it's fine. I'm waiting for everyone to leave, and then I would. I didn't want to just leave because if I did, everything would go off.
I think they have left for some other thing to do, so we can, I think, stop now.
Okay. Okay, yes,
Okay.
it's just 5 of us. I'm just going to go ahead and end it.
Yeah. Okay. Bye.
Bye.